In part 1 of this series, we explore the theories of André Bazin, who claimed that the ontology, that is the essence of film, can be found in its indelible link to reality. He also argued that some films exploit that more than others by focusing on the ambiguity, the minutiae, the often uneventfulness of everyday life. Bazin's theories are the foundation of what we think when we think about realism. However, they were all written over 60 years ago, and a lot has happened between then and now. So, the first step to move forward in our theory of realism is to move inward. That is because much of what characterizes our experience of reality is sensorial. We can tell that something is real because we can touch it, smell it, taste it. To understand how this relates to realist cinema, we must first start by reading a theorist who, despite having never cited and seemingly never read Bazin, also wrote about the relationship between cinema and reality in a very similar time period as him. I'm talking about Siegfried Kracauer and the book Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality. The start of Kracauer's argument is similar to that of Bazin's. Cinema enjoys a closer proximity with reality than any other art form. Therefore, it is rich ground for a realist aesthetics. On top of that, cinema also redeems physical reality. That is, it elevates it, transports it to a different plane. Kracauer claims that most other art forms, like say painting, move from above to below. They aim to give physical form to a metaphysical concept. Meanwhile, cinema moves from below to above. It necessarily starts from the object itself. And this is where Kracauer's discussion of style differs from that of Bazin. If you recall, Bazin praises depth of field as the primary technique to make us experience film as we do reality. Meanwhile, Kracauer's interest in the object and its proximity implies that we as viewers need to be able to perceive its texture and sensorial qualities, which means that the primary technique the film can use to approach reality is the close-up. Quote, "While the theatre-goer watches a spectacle which affects primarily their mind and only through it their sensibility, the moviegoer finds themselves in a situation in which they cannot ask questions and grope for answers unless they are saturated physiologically. Therefore, the effect of cinema as a whole, and in particular realist cinema, is that of bringing the object close to us. This can make us confront images that would be too abhorrent and horrific to be experienced in reality. It can also bring us in closer proximity to places and peoples that are geographically far from where we live. And why not empathize with their reality by confronting it to our own, often noticing similarities? What I want to take out of Kracauer for this particular video is this link between the real and the sensorial, as well as the material. But also keep in mind this comment on the relationship between realism and world cinema, which is something that both Bazin and Kracauer point out and keeps coming back. Meanwhile, it's about time I move on from these old mummified theorists and look at how some more recent thinkers have interpreted the same questions. When talking about the materiality, the tactility of the cinematic image, the most useful framework to use is film phenomenology. Now, the whole phenomenology debate is a bit too much for me to get into. I should probably make a separate video about it. However, I would be remiss if I didn't at least address it here, since it's the most useful way to translate Kracauer's concerns into a more contemporary framework. So, the quickest way to touch on the question of film phenomenology would be to look at Vivian Sobchack's foundational text, The Address of the Eye, where, starting from the theories on language of phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the author argues that the primary aspect of film experience is its embodiment, its ability to affect the senses, which a lot of theorists before her had ignored in order to focus on thought and ideology and all the stuff that comes after immediate sensory perception. We're not just talking about sight and sound here. Sobchack claims that film works through synesthesia, the stimulation of one sense by the other. So, for instance, you could see a character on screen put their hand on an open flame, and your own body would react as if your own hand were being burnt. This embodiment, Sobchack claims, is common to all cinema viewers, unlike, say, intellectual engagement, whatever that is, which can vary vastly from one person to the other. Thus, thinking of cinema through the senses can help us universalize the film experience. Now, I'm going to stop here with Sobchack, since she's not specifically talking about realism. However, it's useful to note how her theories seem to echo Kracauer's thought on cinema bringing other realities closer to us through the senses. It just goes to show how sensoriality is a quality of realist cinema. Although I sort of glossed over the 1970s and 80s in terms of written theory, I do want to look at a film from those eras before concluding this video. This is because one of the texts that single-handedly inspired me to write this second part of the series is Ivone Margulies' Nothing Happens, Chantal Akerman's Hyperrealist Every Day, and I really want to talk about this director while I have the chance. As the title of Margulies' book suggests, Akerman works with a cinema of the everyday, where nothing happens, like in the realist films praised by Bazin. Also, she's an extensive user of deep focus cinematography and wide shots, which were also praised by Bazin for their realist qualities. Yet, Akerman also imbues her films with qualities that are inherently material, sensorial, all without even needing close-ups. This makes her cinema the perfect way to link parts 1 and 2 of this video series. Let's have a look at her most famous film, Jean Dillman, 23, Quai du Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles. Almost the whole film is constituted by everyday vignettes of the protagonist doing house chores in a routine-like behavior, which is a push to the extreme of the sequence from Umberto D that I spoke about in the previous video. On top of that, each action is shot from beginning to end in a single static take, often starting before she enters the room and ending after she leaves. Even events as notable as her receiving money from clients in exchange for sex work are framed as simple parts of her routine. Paradoxically, some of the only times when the film uses temporal ellipses to skip over an action occur when we have seen it before, since we, as viewers, already know it's part of a routine and we don't need to see it again. Oh, and this goes on for almost 3.5 hours. If you wonder what I personally think of this film, 5 out of 5. Anyway, back to Margulies. She precisely analyzes these static long takes as being able to enhance the sensorial qualities of Jean's environment. Quote, "Through extended duration, the spectator experiences the pro-filmic event as an expansive materiality. The dishcloth, her apron, the weight of plates, the soup tureen on the dining table all become heightened synesthetic foci. By spending so much time with Jean in her environment, the environment itself starts assuming real qualities for us. In turn, Akerman uses this to make us really, and I mean really, empathize with Jean. Margulies calls this a hyper-realism for a reason. In more recent years, similar concerns have been raised by Tiago de Luca in Realism of the Senses in World Cinema, a book adapted from the author's PhD thesis, which was supervised by Lucia Naguib, someone whose name you may want to keep in mind for the next video. The Luca's aim in this book is precisely to bring together Bazanian notions of realism with phenomenology by looking at the cinemas of Carlos Regadas, Tsai, Ming-liang and Gus Van Sant as proponents of a, quote, new realist aesthetic steeped in the hyperbolic application of the long take, which promotes a sensuous viewing experience anchored in materiality and duration. In other words, these are cinemas characterized by a sensory mode of address based on the protracted inspection of physical reality. Aside from the obvious parallels with slow cinema, to which all of the directors analyzed by the Luca obviously belong, this line of inquiry once again goes to show the link between traditional Bazanian realist aesthetics and phenomenological concepts like synesthesia. These films are real because they affect the embodied spectator. I also find it interesting how all of these theories keep bringing us back towards cinema, which, if you remember from my slow cinema video, I described in very generalized terms as non-Hollywood. The reason why word cinema so often overlaps with realism is that there has historically been a difference between Hollywood realism, which is all about forgetting that you're watching a film and completely immersing yourself in the narrative, and directors like Chantal Akerman or Tsai Ming-liang, whose approach to cinema is more like you are watching a film and you're gonna feel it with your whole body! So, this is materiality and the senses, and how they relate to realism. When confronting this video to the previous entry in the series, you may notice something I notably omitted, which is medium specificity, the ontology of film, which is the key drive in Bazan's interest in realism. And there is certainly much to say about the link between materiality and the medium of film. Just think about how a lot of the medium's link to reality comes from the fact that the film strip can be touched, and it's not just an image on the other side of the screen. However, now that we're reading theory written in the 90s and beyond, as well as watching films that are growing more and more contemporary, it feels wrong to talk about the medium in the same way as Bazan did. The reason is that something happened in the 1980s, and then continued happening with more and more frequency ever since. But I can't quite put my finger on what it is.
One so horrible had never before been bestowed.